Leaders are taught that being tougher is the key to overcoming any challenge. But what does it actually mean to be tough? Well, for many, that may mean, hiding your fears or insecurities or weaknesses no matter what you're up against. It's the idea that rolling up one's proverbial sleeves and putting in more hours or grinding it out, well, that's the only way to get what you need or to accomplish what you're setting out to accomplish. But is that really true? That the key to toughness and therefore success for leaders just comes down to holding on tighter and gripping until you can see the whites of your knuckles? Well, we don't think so at Leadership Vision, and neither does the author, performance expert, executive coach, and runner, Steve Magness. Today on the podcast, Brian Schubring and I are going to discuss his latest book, Do Hard Things, Why We Get Resilience Wrong, and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness. We'll share a brief overview, give a couple of our biggest takeaways, and then share a few tips that we think will help you to better understand toughness and how you can apply that to your leadership and ultimately to doing hard things. Hey everyone, it's Nathan Freeberg. Welcome back to the Leadership Vision podcast, our show helping you build positive team culture. We're a consulting firm that has spent 25 years investing in teams so that people are mentally engaged and emotionally healthy. Brian, I am curious, what is your earliest memory of this idea of toughness, and where did it come from?
Well, for me, this could be similar to you, Nathan. My first experience of toughness, I am drawn right back to football practice on a dirt field, which could have been just dirty concrete. It was that hard. There was no grass, but we had a coach, and he was tough. And this whole toughness thing was a mixture of excruciating workouts to public shaming to just crazy workouts. But if you weren't tough, he'd call you out and he'd make an example of you. But that was it. And it was kind of like what you were saying. You just grind it out. You work harder, and no matter how much the pain, toughness came by working through that pain. How about for you?
Yeah. Similarly, I don't remember kind of that stereotypical toughness metaphor from my parents, but I know that popular culture and stories that we looked up to as a kid, or the best probably memory that sticks. Did you watch The Last Dance, the Chicago Bulls documentary?
Portions of it, not all of it. It's on the list.
It's really good. But the flu game where Michael Jordan supposedly played through I remember that as a kid and being like, wow, that is a sign of greatness, is when you, against all odds, just play through this ridiculous, no matter how much it hurts. And then into my, post-college years, I kind of translated that into the business / entrepreneurial world of just to get ahead, you just have to work harder than everyone else. You have to put in the hours, you have to grind. And then, I kind of took that approach to my marathon training as well. And what's interesting is that I'm that's just not me. I am not that I'm not a hard worker, but I am not if something hurts or if something's hard, I want to be like, hang on a second, why is this hard? Why is this hurting? And, I think a lot of the, my buddies and stuff I grew up with, they a lot of, former football players and that, and they had that exact what you're describing. And so I think kind of by, it just kind of rubbed off on me that's oh, this is what it means to be tough, right?
Well, Nathan, I've spent a majority of my life as a person and in my athletic career.
I've spent my whole life as a person, so I appreciate you spent the majority of your life as a person.
As a person. As an athlete, business owner, the mantra of pain is progress. The pain is a sign that you're making progress. And that navigate everything. If the workouts weren't painful enough, if I wasn't getting hit hard enough in my hockey career, if there wasn't that sense of pain, the victory or the accomplishment or the workout wasn't the same as if there was pain. And I didn't even begin to transition out of that until my 50s, until I really began to rethink.
That's true.
That needing medical attention after every single marathon you've done, that's not a sign of accomplishment. That's a sign of maybe foolishness. But yeah, pain's a partner. Pain's my training partner, has been.
Well, And we're going to get into like some specific takeaways, but it reminds me of the example that he used in the book, and I've heard it, other people talk about it too, that sometimes that athlete, the image of the athlete, like losing their mind, think of like John McEnroe in tennis, like somehow that is like, oh, that guy's so tough because he seems to care so much about this thing that he's like, losing it at the ref, or he's fighting with another player. But really, like what Magness talks about in this book, he's like, no, that's the opposite of it. Like you're not tough. You cannot keep it together. And that's really, if anything, a giant sign of weakness. So, the guy who takes a break, or, like I remember high school cross country, it's like, oh, you have an injury and you're sitting out. Oh, that's, weak sauce is what we would call that.
Weak sauce.
Weak sauce, yeah. So
interesting.
It's not very fun. What I want to do here is just kind of literally read the summary from the book, kind of figure out our flow here as we go, but just sort of talk about our takeaways. We have this shared Google Doc where we have a few different takeaways. We'll certainly have a different perspective on them, but a couple similar ones. So what is this book about? In Do Hard Things, Magness teaches us how we can work with our body, how experiencing discomfort, leaning in, paying attention, and creating space to take thoughtful action can be the true indications of cultivating inner strength. He offers 4 core pillars to cultivate such resilience, which we're not going to go through all of these in detail. But pillar 1 is ditch the facade, embrace reality. Pillar 2, listen to your body. Pillar 3, respond instead of react. And pillar 4, transcend discomfort. Smart and wise all at once, Magness flips the script on what it means to be resilient, drawing from mindfulness, military case studies, sports psychology, neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy. He provides a roadmap for navigating life's challenges and achieving high performance that makes us happier, more successful, and ultimately better people. And what I maybe should have prefaced, he uses a lot of sports metaphors and analogies, and he was almost a professional runner, but it's not a sports book. Like, I think sports is such an easy example to draw on from some of these things, but he talks a lot about business. He talks about leadership. He talks about leading a team. He talks about parenting. And so some of these principles that we're going to share today are not really have anything to do with sports. Although Brian and I were talking before we started recording that we're both athletes, former athletes. Currently, you're always an athlete. And so like that's part of our story. And so that's like we're going to be talking about it, but it just applies to so much. So anything you want to add about that real quick before I think I'm going to have you go first and share one of your takeaways first. Anything you want to add though about the high-level summary?
As a high-level summary, my invitation is that if there are people who are interested in reading the book, that they understand that Steve Magness does approach the perspective of writing through the lens of an athlete, but he quickly disperses those metaphors and those experiences for great applicability, no matter who you are. And that's one of the things that I liked about it, is he uses the sports illustrations as a threshold over which he steps to broadly apply the concepts that he's talking about. So it's a very invitational read.
Okay, Brian, so share one of your big takeaways from this book.
Well, Nathan, the biggest takeaway that I have is the way that Steve Magness focuses on this idea of, this is who I am. I accept who I am and my background. I'm writing from that perspective because, hey, this is how I see the world. And I was keenly attracted to that immediately because as an athlete, I tend to struggle with my self-acceptance as an athlete because I don't believe it's directly applicable to everyone else. So I've often shaded or clouded my worldview as an athlete, believing that I can better relate to people if I don't use that lens. What Steve does is say the exact opposite, which I think is part of the theme of the book. He flips the script and says, this is the lens through which I see the world. That's just who I am. And for me, that happened in the first chapter of the book. And that was one of the main takeaways for me is this grand invitation. It's like, yep, Brian, you're an athlete and that's part of how you see the world. It's a great part of how you see the world. Embrace that and just see through that lens.
What's interesting is that I started reading this book before Brian, and I was like, hey, you should read it too so we can do this discussion. And that was one of the reasons in that first chapter or two, whatever it was, I was like, I think Brian's going to like this because it's so much about embrace who you are as a person. I think this probably falls in like the first pillar of ditching the facade and embracing reality of don't pretend to be someone else. Don't try to adhere to some other set of values. It's like, be who you are and use that as a way to embrace toughness as it looks like for you. So
what's your big takeaway, Nathan?
So what's interesting too is that I had one giant takeaway that has so many drop downs. So he has this quote, and I think we're going to come back to a few times, but it's anything that makes you uncomfortable is an opportunity to train your mental muscle to sit with that feeling and navigate it. The book isn't really what you think it's about, or it wasn't what I thought it was about. It wasn't like, here's some tools of how you're going to run a marathon or, accomplish this giant thing. It's more about the hard things. The hardest thing in life is keeping your stuff together, is keeping your cool when everything else around you is spinning into chaos. And I think of how applicable that is to, an athlete who is performing. And an athlete could be someone out there doing their first 5K, someone who's playing rec tennis and they're doing a pickup tennis match with someone, and it can be anything. Pickleball, exactly, anything. Parenting, leadership. There's so much. How do you keep your mind clear and focused and in check when everything else is spinning out around you? When you're driving the kids home from school, they're tired and hungry and they're screaming. You're tired and hungry, maybe not screaming, but really frustrated, annoying. How do you keep your mind in the proverbial game?
Yeah. Yep.
So I have a lot more I could say about that, but how did that idea sit with you? Because I know that's something that you and I've been talking, before this book, have been talking about, with just some of the mindfulness stuff that we've been working on.
Well, that idea that you're referring to is that anything that makes you uncomfortable is an opportunity to train your mental muscle to sit with that feeling and navigate it. As you know, I have been working for years to try to better understand my feelings and my emotions. For the last 18 months, I've been under the care of a performance and mindfulness coach. Part of this is the exercise. So when I saw this in the book, of course, I recognized it. But where it really began to make sense for me, Nathan, was in the last third of the book. I think the pillar is in the transcend discomfort in pillar 4.
Yeah.
Because Steve Magness began to talk about what happens when feelings become so strong. And he made the connection between feelings are data, they're pieces of information, and feelings can often determine how our emotions are responding to a situation. So he separated feelings from emotions to sit with that difference. That was a huge takeaway for me, because one of the things that he said, Nathan, which has turned into a mantra of mine, is he said something about how a feeling is not a determinant of your emotional capacity or your emotional or physical well-being. And he gave an example of how he was in a race and how what he was feeling was determining that he wasn't physically ready for the race and wasn't emotionally ready for the challenge. And he realized that he can separate the feeling from this judgment. And I took that away as huge, because his advice was, when feelings start to arise, create space for the feeling to exist. And in creating space, you're with the feeling, but you're also separating from the feeling so that you can experience what's happening in the moment and realize if you have the physical or mental capability to actually, go after or kind of move through whatever the challenge is. So that was a big shaping part of this book on how I think as an athlete and as a professional.
I wrote down another quote: feelings are signals that need to be understood.
Yeah.
And what I really love about that is our bodies, we don't have a lot of tools readily available to us to figure out what's really going on. Are we frustrated? Are we hungry? Are we angry? Are we, whatever it is. And so this idea, and this is actually one of our takeaways for later, but this idea of using everything that we're feeling to interpret it. And sometimes we don't have the luxury to stop and journal or actually, what is this feeling, this sensation mean right now? But in the last, I don't know, couple of weeks since I finished the book, anytime I flip out on my kids or get really annoyed, with my wife, or, be annoyed, not that I'm annoyed at Brian and Linda ever, but there's, something at work that I'm what's happening? And I was oh wait, this is data. This is an opportunity, much in the same way as you look at your bank account and be I thought that number would be bigger. It's okay, let's look and see what happened. It's the same kind of practice. And It's really hard. I don't know if you've found any nice takeaways, but I'm wondering if you can kind of leading into that. So you wrote down zooming, and I loved this story in here about like zooming in and zooming out, which is also something that we talk about at Leadership Vision slightly differently. But like sometimes you need to hyper focus on that little tiny feeling. Sometimes you need to zoom way out to the big picture.
Yep.
Talk about what that is, and then why you wrote that as one of your top takeaways.
Well, I wrote that down as one of the top takeaways because at Leadership Vision, we've been using the term zoom in, zoom out for over 10 years. And so when Steve Magness used the term zooming, it's a verb, which I like that. And it's what we talk to our clients about all the time. And Nathan, as you know, as a team, we do the same thing. I also have the luxury of having done a lot of research just on this idea of zooming in and zooming out prior to the book. Why it caught my attention in Steve Magness's book is because he's not only saying there is a time when we need to zoom in and really narrow the aperture of what we're seeing. There's a time to focus on those details to get something done or to navigate. But there's also this need to also zoom out, again, creating space between us and the task or the emotion or the feeling or the relationship. Zoom out and see the entire landscape. That often changes your perspective. And then one of the things that Steve also mentions is then the need to just see, like to just see. Sometimes you just need to be where you are, exactly where you are. There's no need to zoom in or zoom out. Just see what's around you. Just see what's in your perspective. And I like that because I think that that's where the balance really falls for me. That's my first part. And the second part is, and I'll refer to my book on page 208 and 209. He begins to list different types of zooming. And I want to mention this in the podcast. I really think that for our listeners, it's helpful to hear lists sometimes so that we as an individual have the opportunity to connect with one or two things in the list to give ourselves permission to say, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. That's what I do. And also to raise our curiosity. There could be something in this list where you think, oh, I never thought of zooming in or zooming out on that piece. So I'm just going to read quickly what they are. Number one is visual zooming. And he talks about portrait mode versus panorama mode. And I just like that, just visually, what are you seeing? Because there are so many data points that we can get to what we see. Number two is cognitive zooming. And that is about the thought process, common answers, areas of interest, data you're picking up cognitively. Number three, physical zooming. You can imagine what that's like. What I love about this, I've been using it a lot with the people that I'm coaching, is he cites a study where people that actually lean into a conversation, like just that physicality of like leaning your upper body into a conversation, have a much more narrow aperture of understanding as those that like lean back. When that leaning back physically opens up your mental aperture. Temporal zooming is about like getting into a space of thinking about the future and looking forward. Linguistic zooming and the importance of language and the words that you use. The specificity of word choice, as well as the broad, more open-ended word choices and how you create your sentences. Environmental zooming, I think you kind of think of what that is. What's your context? Who's around you? Physical space, lighting, heat, warmth. And that's 6. And I would add number 7 for the sake of this conversation, which I'm kind of surprised that he doesn't bring in here. And that's emotional zooming. Like the zooming in on the feelings, zooming out on the core emotion, zooming in on what's actually inspiring that feeling, what's happening around you, and then doing some work to how it is that you're going to actually respond emotionally, because he does spend a lot of time talking about how we respond to our emotions, kind of like what you're saying earlier, Nathan, of being with and sitting with to navigate. So I would add number 7, emotional zooming.
The one that I really liked in that section was temporal zooming.
Okay, why is that?
Well, I'll read you. When you're going through a difficult time, ask how you might feel about this in 6 months, a year, or even 10 years down the road. Imagine how future you would think about your current situation. Often reminds us that whatever we are going through is temporary. And that's something that I've been kind of reading a little bit of like philosophy about, that everything is temporary. The very good stuff, the very bad stuff. That's why it's like so important to be in the present and to enjoy what's happening here. But that idea of, however difficult a situation is right now, it's like, okay, in 6 months, am I going to care about this? It's like, no, I'm just mildly annoyed at this person, at my neighbor for doing this. It's like, all right, like it can just give perspective in a way that I hadn't really considered something like that. And what's interesting is my wife and I were recently just kind of reflecting on like our time since we lived in Portland, and, we're almost married 20 years. And so things that like, 10, 15 years ago, I was like, remember when that was so incredibly important and now we don't care about that at all? Like, it's funny how you can get worked up about something in one season of life or at one time, and then it's just no longer that important.
One of the things I want to add, Nathan, for us and for our listeners is when I read that temporal zooming, what I also know as a practice is, yes, it's helpful to understand that this moment that we're in right now is temporary and will it matter 10, 15 years from now or 6 months from now. I also do the temporal zooming looking backwards because it really gives me a sense to look at, yep, this moment is temporary. And if I look backwards, I can see how I have been prepared emotionally, professionally, intellectually, and relationally to actually navigate what's happening in the moment. As the challenges come up in business or with clients or whatever, I always have this fear and freak out like reaction right away. But when I take a temporal zooming approach and think about how I got here, it's almost this reassurance of, yeah, I've navigated something just like this or very similar before. I know who to call or how to answer the email. It's really not new. And I also know that it's temporary and we will move through this. It just may not be the route that I would prefer, but it is a route around or through. And that's also how this temporal zooming can help me too. It is the looking forward, and I also use it looking backward.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And that might be a good transition into some of our takeaways.
Okay.
Because my kind of first takeaway, and by the way, I should mention like these takeaways, yes, it's for our listeners, but also it's like, these are my personal takeaways of like what I'm going to try to do. So that idea of leaning into those uncomfortable situations and spend some time sitting with that uncomfortable feeling. And to your point, Brian, it's like, if you think about like the future me or the past me, it's, I think all of us probably have things in our life that are repetitive barriers to helping us do tough things. And again, a tough thing could be an athletic accomplishment or, getting a job promotion or leading a team in a certain way. And so when you think about, like, let's just say you're the type of person who is maybe you get frustrated easily when, things aren't done the way you think they should be done. And so, if you're like, okay, do I want to be this same type of person in next year, in 5 years, in 10 years? The only way to do that, to lean into those uncomfortable situations. Every time you have an interaction with a coworker, they're like, I was a little too sharp with them. I was a little too curt, whatever.
Yep.
Sit with that, process that. Because what I think about, and this applies in my work life and my parenting, is like, okay, next year, do I still want to be someone who is like struggling with the same, like I got the same injury, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I've not seen a PT for it. I have not done the right stretching or strength training. And so my big takeaway is this idea of leaning into those, and this is straight from the book, leaning into those uncomfortable situations and spending some time sitting with that uncomfortable feeling. Because I don't know about you, Brian, but too often I want to be like, oh, that was a really, like we have some former coworkers. I was like, I was not my best self when I interacted with that person. Let's just ignore it. Let's just let it go away. And then a couple of weeks go by, the same thing happens. But sitting with them, okay, how could I have done better? How could I have maybe taken a moment or whatever? So I have like a second part to that, but I'm curious, any thoughts on that?
I don't have any additional thoughts on it because the sitting with is important. And what I've learned is you're sitting with a feeling, an emotion, or an experience. And what's helpful for me is to discern is that feeling, emotion, experience is not me. I am sitting with that, or I'm living with that for this moment, but that's not who I am. It's a lived experience. Like one of my takeaways is create space. And I'm not used to that. I'm used to embracing and owning and shouldering instead of creating space and creating a healthy separation to be alive and free with the feeling, the emotion, or the experience.
Yeah. So creating space, let's go on that because that was kind of the second part of mine. So I've just sort of given myself and our listeners this challenge to like lean into and kind of sit with that uncomfortable feeling. And I would love your honest take on this because we haven't talked about it. So like, what does that mean? What does that mean to like sit with this uncomfortable grossness? And kind of my plan or what I'm, doing is like, so journaling, I'm not really a journaler, but I'm kind of learning to like, let's write this down. I felt this way. This happened. Like my throat got dry. My mouth got dry. Like I started sweating. Like what was going on? And then, books and podcasts and like practicing some mindful meditation, finding resources. I think it's one thing to like just kind of sit by yourself in a dark room and ruminate, because that's the dark, like where this can go bad, right? It's like you just ruminate and ruminate. Then it's like, okay, if I'm, my mind kind of failed me here. How do I get better at it? So I can do some tough things, so I can have hard conversations, so I can, become more mentally tough, so that the next time then I need to kind of embrace some of these things. Does that make sense? Like what do you hear in my ramble there?
What I'm hearing is ultimately what's coming to my mind is the question of how do I sit with and create space? And one of the things that I believe from lived experience and observed experience is that people are often ill-equipped to sit with their struggles and find a healthy way, because we tend to fall back into those well-worn patterns of our psychology and our psyche. So what I would say, or what I would suggest, because this is what I do for myself, is how do I provide myself with an objective observation from someone or something that serves as an outsider? So an objective observation. So think of 3 O's: objective, observation, outsider. And so, Nathan, I know you and I use the same mindfulness meditation app. And so that, to me, that app provides me with an objective observation on a lived experience or reality from a true outsider that causes me to be able to be with whatever it is I'm experiencing, to be less anxious, and to have another perspective to help me navigate just how I am trying to create space with something, and how it is I can take a few steps forward or inward. And that's been really helpful for me. Now, I've been journaling for almost 40 years every day. So that process of sitting with how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, and what I'm exploring, that's not new to me. But that objectivity, I'm trying to like raise the volume level on the objectivity that I'm receiving. That's kind of what I'm searching for right now, is a differentiation from how I have been thinking to how I am thinking. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm wondering, one of your takeaways is finding reference points that are smarter than you. Is this?
Whew. Yeah.
Is this tied into that? Talk about like the coach and the app and other things.
Well, one of the things I like about Steve Magness is he is not afraid to reference people or studies or research that are smarter than him. And that resonates with me, because that's kind of how I do my work, is I'm always trying to find a reference point or a reference voice that's smarter than me, to not only elevate or expand my thinking, but to maybe deepen or ground my feeling in trying to find a place that resonates with me in that process. So that's one of my great takeaways, is Steve Magness modeled that as an author and as a practitioner. And it just connected with me, because that's that's just part of my practice, what I'm continuing to do. But what's different for me now is I recognize that I am in a need of a differentiated perspective than what I've had before. And I think that that's maybe part of the invitation that I'm hearing from this book, is that there is a different way of how we can think about our reality. We don't have to settle for old ways of thinking to navigate new ways of being. And that's the invitation that I think is really coming forward for me.
Yeah, that's good. Another takeaway we have here that you kind of started talking about at the beginning, accept and embrace your identity and perspective and lived experience and interpretive framework. Flow with what you know. That sounds like it should be on a t-shirt or something.
We can make the t-shirt and then we can sell it.
How is that a takeaway? Or that's not the right word. Make that more practical. Because embracing like who you are and your identity is such a long process. Like, how does someone actually go and do that today?
Yeah. Self-awareness and self-acceptance is a lifelong journey. Every one of us have examples of how we have sought to better understand who we are and then struggle to accept actually who we are. And the idea of flow is not only a psychological reality of, how the greatest mathematicians or composers or athletes or whoever, when they're in their flow, like everything seems to be connecting. I'm sure our listeners have had that moment. And part of what I was taken away from the book is Steve Magness is inviting us to go with the flow of what you know. So he does that, like, this is who I am. So he's addressing it to his self-acceptance of I am an athlete. I am this, that our thing. He's also saying, go with the flow, like, of what I know. And that is as an athletic, achievement-oriented, goal-oriented, extremely high accomplishment. That's also part of flow with what you know. I think that if people can discover that current that can carry them, it doesn't mean that we don't have to navigate. It doesn't mean that it can be, not difficult at times. It certainly can be. But so many of us, myself included, have tried to swim against the current or to try to row against the current of actually who we are as an identity. And part of the conceptual framework of flow is that there is an ease with which this happens. There's a moment like when all the lights are on. It doesn't happen for very long. It does have an end point, but there's something about working with ourselves, and sometimes our greatest desires, ambitions, cautions, and intuition are part of our psyche saying to us, maybe we're drifting a little bit. It's almost as if our inner being is asking us to stay in our flow.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this is where, a greater understanding of your strengths can come into play too. Not to like pigeonhole your flow into like a profession, but just into like, wait a second, I'm in an area that I'm not passionate about. I'm not very good at. Doesn't come natural to me. And so like listening to those messages as well, I think can be really, really powerful. So Brian, any final thoughts?
Well, I would highly recommend the book by Steve Magness, Do Hard Things, because I really do believe that people respond well to counterintuition and different ways of thinking and feeling. And I believe that what Steve Magness is doing is he's providing a counterintuitive approach to what it means to be tough and what it means to do hard things. And he's also agitating our thinking in soft ways and direct ways to try to wrestle with how is it that we can actually live with our feelings, our emotions, our relationships, and understand ourselves better, understand others better, so that we can live a more full and fulfilling life.
I love that. My, I think, final thought would actually be a tie-in to one of our courses that we release, the Seeing Strengths from a New Perspective. One of the lessons in that is called How All Strengths Break, and how to put them back together again. And it's this idea that when you're pushed too far, when your strengths are pushed too far, when they're kind of off track, how do you find rest and kindness and compassion for yourself? And that's the one thing, he does touch on that a little bit, but like, how do you, and that's a great course, by the way, anybody who wants to like, from a strengths wants to like go deeper and just understand like a whole bunch of like 6 totally different ideas about strengths that never been before shared on the internet. But how do you, in all of this learning, in all of this sitting with the yucky stuff that happens, how do you have self-compassion for yourself? How do you, what you said earlier is like, okay, this is not me. I'm a good team member, a good parent, a good spouse, a good friend, a good whatever that just had a really tough moment there. And so how do I kind of remember that? Because I think my default is just beat myself up and be like, oh, I'm terrible. I shouldn't have done it that way. I was actually the other morning, I was reflecting on something from 6 months ago that happened at school. I was like, oh, I really dropped the ball on that. It's kind of like, it's like, well, it doesn't do any good to rehash that now. But Brian, this was fun. You and I have never really done a book port together. A book club. Maybe we should start a Leadership Vision Book of the Month or something and see what happens. So Brian, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan. This was fun.
Yeah. And thank you for listening to the Leadership Vision podcast, sharing our expertise in the discovery, practice, and implementation of a strengths-based approach to people, teams, and culture. For more resources on developing your strengths, the strengths of your team, or the strengths of your entire organization, or to learn how to do hard things for yourself, you can visit us on the web at leadershipvisionconsulting.com or click the link in the show notes. I'm Nathan Freeberg.
And I am Brian Schubring.
And on behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening.